The boy sat on the cold wooden bench, his small fingers gripping the edge as though the hardness of the wood might stop the shaking in his chest. And his eyes never left the fragile figure of his mother who sat at the front of the courtroom, her hands trembling in her lap as though she were holding an invisible weight too heavy to bear. And though the room was filled with voices, judges, lawyers, strangers debating her life, her silence seemed louder than all of them, pressing down on him like a storm about to break. And in that silence, he felt something sharp, something heavy, a realization that no one else was going to stand for her. No one else was going to rise and speak the truth she carried inside, but could not utter. And the thought made his heart pound harder, as if urging him to act though he was only a child. Yet, as the trial moved on, words flew like arrows. Accusations painted his mother as someone she was not, twisting stories, bending facts. And every lie seemed to push her further into the shadows, while he wanted to scream that they were wrong. But his throat locked each time, because who would listen to a boy? Who would believe him, overgrown men in suits with papers and power? And still, something inside refused to let him stay still. Because he remembered the nights when his mother worked until her hands ached, just to keep food on their table. He remembered the mornings she woke before dawn to make sure he had something warm to eat before school. And he remembered how she never once asked for help, never once complained about her burdens. And now here she was, accused, judged, her voice stripped away. And it was unbearable to him that such strength, such sacrifice, could be dismissed so easily. And he noticed how she kept her head low, as though the world had already decided she was guilty. And the sight tore at him because he wanted her to raise her chin, to look them in the eyes, to show them she was not what they said. But fear held her silent, and the boy could almost feel it. That fear crawling across the room and binding her tighter with every word spoken. And his hands began to sweat, his lips pressed together so hard they almost hurt, because the urge to shout, to rise, to break the silence was no longer something he could resist, but something that demanded to be answered. And as he looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces of strangers who did not know her, who did not care, he realized he was the only one who did, the only one who carried her truth. And the weight of that knowledge made him dizzy, yet also lit a fire in his chest. And in that moment the boy understood that silence was a prison. Silence was surrender, and if he chose it now, if he stayed hidden on the bench, his mother's voice would remain buried, lost beneath the lies of others. And the thought of that loss filled him with a courage that did not feel like courage at all, but more like desperation, more like love refusing to die. And though his knees shook as he pushed himself up, though his throat tightened as the room turned toward him with curious, cold eyes, he did not sit back down, for he knew that, even if his words stumbled, even if his voice cracked, it was better to try than to let her disappear in silence. And as he opened his mouth, the hush that fell over the courtroom felt like the universe holding its breath, waiting, testing, and in that charged stillness, he found the strength to speak. Not because he was fearless, but because fear itself had shown him what silence would cost. The judge's voice was calm, but heavy as he began to read from his notes, his words echoing through the courtroom like the tolling of a bell. And everyone sat in stillness, their eyes fixed on him, waiting to hear what would be said about the woman seated in front. But before the second sentence could leave his lips, a small sound broke through the air, the scrape of a bench, the shuffle of tiny shoes on the floor, and then the boy was on his feet, his heart hammering so loud he thought the whole room must hear it. Yet his voice came out stronger than he believed possible, as he said, "I will speak for my mother," and for a moment time seemed to stop, the words hanging in the air, sharp and bold against the silence that followed. And then gasps filled the room like a sudden wave, some shocked, some whispering to one another in disbelief, and all eyes turned to him, the child who had no place in this world of judges, lawyers, and witnesses, and yet stood as if he did, his small frame looking fragile against the tall walls and polished wood, but his posture was firm, his chin lifted, not with arrogance, but with an unshaken will. And the judge paused, his gavel frozen in hand, staring at the boy with a mixture of surprise and unease, because such defiance from a child was something rare, something unsettling in the order of the court. And though he could have ordered silence, though he could have told the boy to sit back down, the power in that young voice held him still, as if even he was curious to hear what might follow. And the lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some smirking at the audacity, others frowning at the disruption, but none daring to speak first. And in the middle of this storm stood the boy's mother, her hands trembling more than before, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. For she had never asked him to do this, never imagined he would dare. Yet in the depth of her gaze there flickered a lighted glimmer of something she had lost long ago, faint but alive. And the boy, though his stomach twisted with nerves, caught that flicker and held on to it like a rope, pulling him forward. And he repeated himself, his voice steadier this time, "I will speak for my mother." And the sound of it echoed differently now, no longer a cry of desperation, but a vow, a line drawn in a place where no one expected it. And slowly the judge leaned back, his eyes narrowing, his silence stretching long enough that the entire courtroom seemed to lean with him, waiting, wondering if he would crush this act of courage or allow it. And in that pause every detail became sharper: the rustle of papers, the cough of an old man in the back row, the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, and the boy felt each sound as if the world itself was holding its breath. And though doubt whispered inside him, though part of him wanted to sink back down, he did not move, for he knew if he sat again, if he let this moment slip, his mother's voice would remain buried. And with that thought fueling him, his eyes locked on the judge's, refusing to look away. And the silence stretched until it became unbearable, until finally the judge exhaled and spoke, his tone low and cautious. "This is highly irregular," and murmurs rippled across the room. But still, he did not strike the gavel. Still, he did not silence the child. And that small allowance was enough to shift the air, enough to make everyone realize that something unexpected had begun, something that could not easily be dismissed. And as the boy stood, trembling yet unbroken, the entire courtroom felt it too, the fragile, yet undeniable power of a child who dared to stand where no one believed he belonged. At first, when the boy opened his mouth, his voice trembled like a thin thread about to snap, and his words stumbled over one another, as though fear itself was trying to drag them back into silence. But he forced them out, shaky and unsure, until slowly the sound began to change, growing stronger with every breath. And what started as a whisper of courage soon became a steady rhythm that carried through the courtroom, drawing every ear to him. And though he knew nothing of laws or procedures, though he had never studied arguments or learned the art of persuasion, he spoke with something far greater than training. He spoke with truth, plain and unshaped. And in that truth was a power no one in that room had expected. For he told them of nights when his mother worked long hours, her hands blistered and tired. Yet she returned home with a smile so he would not feel her pain. And he told them of mornings when she rose before the sun, preparing food she sometimes did not eat herself, because there was only enough for one, and she always chose him. And he told them of winters when the house grew cold, when the firewood was too costly, and she wrapped him in her own coat, shivering silently so he might sleep warm. And with each memory he painted a picture no lawyer's crafted words could rival. A picture of sacrifice woven not in grand gestures, but in countless small acts of love that could not be denied. And though some tried to remain unmoved, their faces stiff and skeptical, the boy's words carried a weight that slipped past their defenses, because there was no calculation in his tone, no attempt to twist facts or bend stories, only the raw honesty of a child who had lived every moment he spoke of. And the stillness in the room grew heavier, as though each person was held captive by his fragile but relentless truth. And when he spoke of unfairness, of how his mother was judged not for her heart, but for the mistakes others had painted over her. His eyes glistened, his small fists clenched at his sides, and the trembling of his body only made his words cut deeper. For it was clear he was not rehearsed, not guided, but speaking from the only place he knew, his heart, and that heart spoke louder than any polished argument, louder than any lawyer's clever phrasing, and the judge, who had at first looked upon him with caution, now leaned forward in his seat, his pen still against the paper, as if writing could not capture what he was hearing. And even the lawyers, so used to battles of words, found themselves silent, watching as a child dismantled their carefully built arguments with nothing more than sincerity. And the boy's mother sat frozen, tears slipping down her cheeks, because in all her life of enduring, of swallowing her pain so her child would not see it, she had never imagined that one day he would be the one to speak for her, to show the world what she had hidden. And her trembling hands now pressed against her lips, as if to hold back sobs, while the boy went on, his words no longer shaking but flowing like a stream that had finally broken free from its dam, unstoppable and clear, and the room remained utterly still, every cough silenced, every whisper gone, as if no one dared to break the spell his voice had cast, for in that moment the authority of law, the weight of rules, even the coldness of power seemed small compared to the simple, unpolished truth of a child standing for his mother. And when he finished, when his last words hung in the heavy silence, it was as if the very air in the courtroom had changed, carrying with it the undeniable mark of honesty that could not be ignored, leaving everyone present shaken, not by cleverness, but by the piercing strength of innocence turned into courage. When the boy's last words faded into the air, no one in the courtroom dared to move, and the silence that followed was not the uneasy quiet of disbelief, but a stillness so deep it felt sacred, as though everyone present had been caught in something greater than law or argument, and even the opposing lawyers, who only minutes before had been eager to press their points and show their papers, now sat frozen, their lips sealed. For they knew instinctively that to speak against such raw honesty would only make them appear hollow, and though they held facts and figures and carefully built cases, none of it could outweigh the sincerity of a child who had nothing to gain except the defense of his mother. And as the boy stood there, his small chest rising and falling with the effort of what he had done, the judge leaned forward in his high seat, elbows resting on the bench, his eyes locked on the boy with an intensity that seemed to search beyond words, as if trying to measure not the speech itself, but the soul behind it. And in that moment, the courtroom, once a place of authority and order, became something else entirely, a place where truth was felt more than proven, where justice was not found in documents, but in the quiet weight of the human heart. And the judge, who had heard countless voices in his career pleas, lies, clever defenses, and cold accusations, knew at once that this voice was different, untrained yet unshakable, tender yet piercing, and he could not bring himself to interrupt, could not even raise his gavel to call the boy out of order, because deep inside he recognized that this interruption was perhaps the most necessary moment of the trial. And as the silence stretched, it was no longer filled with disbelief, but something far stronger, respect. A respect that began first in the hearts of strangers, sitting in the benches, who lowered their eyes in shame at ever having doubted the boy's courage, then spread to the lawyers who fidgeted uneasily with their notes, realizing their polished arguments seemed pale in comparison, and finally rested in the judge himself, who, despite years of training to remain firm and unmoved, felt the walls of his own composure bend beneath the weight of what he had witnessed. And in that heavy pause it was as if the scales of justice themselves had shifted, not by evidence or law, but by the voice of a child who had dared to break the silence. And though no verdict had yet been spoken, though no gavel had yet fallen, everyone in that room knew something irreversible had happened, for the truth, once spoken so plainly, could not be erased. And as the boy slowly lowered his eyes, his voice gone, but his presence still powerful. The judge remained in silence, not because he did not know what to say, but because he knew that to speak too quickly would dishonor what had just been given. And so he let the moment breathe, let it sink into every soul present, until respect, quiet and undeniable, became the only law that mattered in that room. When the boy's voice finally grew quiet and he lowered himself back onto the hard wooden bench beside his mother, the entire courtroom remained still, as though the walls themselves were holding on to the weight of what had just been spoken. And his mother, her eyes wet with tears, reached for his hand, squeezing it gently, both to thank him and to reassure herself that what had just happened was real. And for a moment, the judge sat frozen, his throat tight, as he tried to gather the right words. Because in all his years on the bench, he had witnessed countless arguments, seen powerful men and women rise to speak with authority, but never had he seen a child shift the very air of the courtroom with nothing but sincerity. And when he finally cleared his throat, the sound seemed louder than it should have been, almost jarring after the sacred silence that had fallen. And still he hesitated, for how could he continue with business as usual when something extraordinary had just taken place before his eyes? And as he struggled with words, the opposing lawyers glanced nervously at one another, their neatly stacked files and carefully written speeches suddenly feeling meaningless, stripped of their power by the raw honesty of a boy who knew nothing of the law but everything about love and sacrifice. And the spectators, who had entered the room expecting another trial filled with cold debates and rigid rules, now sat in a quiet awe, each one knowing they had witnessed something they would carry with them long after they left. For it was not the facts of the case that clung to them, but the courage of a child who had stood where he had no right to stand and spoken what no one else dared to say. And though the trial was not yet over, though decisions and verdicts still waited to be made, everyone present understood that the course of events had shifted, that truth had risen in its purest form and left a mark that no argument could erase. And as the boy sat close to his mother, his small hand still clasped in hers, there was a strength in the way she held her head now, no longer bowed in silent despair but lifted, fragile, yet proud, for she knew she had already been defended in a way no lawyer could ever match. And she knew that whatever the judge decided, whatever papers were signed, her son's act of bravery had given her back a piece of dignity that the world had tried to strip away. And the judge, after a long pause, finally leaned back, his eyes heavy with thought. And while he did not deliver his decision in that moment, the softness in his expression betrayed that he too had been moved, that beneath the robe and the authority, he was still a man with a heart, touched by a truth too pure to ignore. And so the trial continued, but not in the same way as before. For every word that followed carried the echo of the boy's courage, and whether they admitted it or not, each person in that room knew they would never forget the sight of a child standing tall in a place built for grown men, breaking the silence with a voice that carried more weight than all their documents combined. In that moment, fragile, yet unshakable, became the one that changed everything.